Hi friends, my name is Sarah and I am the Sustainable Innovations Lead here at EcoEnclose. We have just completed the most recent round of research for bioplastics and dissolvable plastics in e-commerce. And I am here to give you a little refresher and let you know a few things that we found during our research, as well as some of our current conclusions. So what we're going to be covering today is a basic overview of what bioplastics are, when to use them, our data-backed research, and some of the data points that we look to when we're considering bioplastics and any new materials in the e-commerce space, some of the key questions that we have developed for vetting out bioplastics in e-commerce, and then lastly, our ideal bioplastic. So a little bit of background here. The reason that we decided to embark on a new round of research on bioplastics in the space of e-commerce, there are a couple of reasons. The first is we are seeing more and more materials in the market that are bio-based and or biodegradable, and lots of new packaging materials in e-commerce specifically are being marketed as compostable, biodegradable, and at EcoEnclose we take a really close look at materials on the market, and we want to be very materials agnostic. So we are going to make a lot of data-based decisions. We want to make sure that new materials really align with our sustainability framework to ensure that they're actually a net positive. So we're going to start off here with what is a bioplastic. So most of the time when we hear the term bioplastic, we are imagining, or at least I am imagining, a plastic that is made from bio-based sources like plants or crops and biodegrades at the end of its life back into a functional compost or soil amendment or additive. And so when I think about bioplastic, that polymer has both of those properties, being bio-based and biodegradable. However, it's important to understand that bioplastic is actually an umbrella term that can mean plastics that are only made from bio-based sources, or plastics that are only biodegradable, or plastics that are both. So it's important to understand when you are vetting out the bioplastic polymer, if it is both biodegradable and bio-based, because that is not always the case for all biopolymers. So this matrix here is an overview of the biopolymers that we researched and where exactly they fit into this umbrella term of bioplastic. So on the left side, we've got quadrant 1 and quadrant 3, which are both not biodegradable. So at the end of their life, that bioplastic, or in quadrant 3's situation, typical petroleum-based plastics, quadrant 1 and quadrant 3 are both not biodegradable at the end of their life. But as you can see, if you look at the top of the matrix, quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 are both polymers made from bio-based sources. And so quadrant 1 is a really interesting group of bioplastics because they are made from bio sources. However, they are not designed to biodegrade. So one of the really cool applications of quadrant 1 bioplastics is as a drop-in bioplastic, which we'll talk a little bit about later. If you look at quadrant 2, this is a bio-based polymer, so made from biosources, and is biodegradable. So this is sort of the middle of that Venn diagram. Quadrant 2 includes things like PLA, PHA, cellophane, starch blends, and PBS. If we move all the way down to quadrant 4, you can see at the bottom here, quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 are both petroleum-based polymers. They're made from fossil fuels. And so that's not something that we typically think of when we think of a bioplastic. We think bioplastic means it's coming from bio-based sources. However, for this group of plastics in quadrant 4, that's actually not the case. They are made from petroleum-based polymers or virgin sources that are not bio-based. However, they are still technically biodegradable, and I'm putting an asterisk after technically, so we'll talk a little bit about that later. bioplastics fall into two main formulation types. And so on the left here, we've got a drop-in bioplastic, and on the right is what's called new formulation biopolymer. And so these two formulations, they really just tell us what that polymer is meant to do, and how it is designed. So as these polymers are developed, they either are designed as a drop-in bioplastic, in which case they're designed to mimic an existing polymer structure. And so they're going to behave exactly the same way as an existing type of polymer, whether that, for example, might be polypropylene or polyethylene. Those drop-in bioplastics, though they're made of biosources, they are designed to have the same function and the same polymer chain as the equivalent that's made from petroleum-based sources. So drop-in bioplastics are really interesting because they can be made from sources that are not petroleum-based, but still contribute to a system that relies almost entirely on recycling. And so those bioplastics can be used as dropped in to that mix to perform the exact same way as a regular petroleum-based plastic. So that's a drop-in bioplastic. Over here on the right, a new formulation bioplastic. This is a polymer that is not designed to mimic any existing plastic or polymer on the market. So it's a new formulation. It's an entirely new polymer structure that's made, and each polymer, because it is unique, it has its own specific end of life. And so quite frequently what we'll see for new formulation bioplastics is their end of life is typically designed around composting or biodegradation through industrial composting systems. You might be wondering what the best use cases for these two different structures and formulations of bioplastics are. And here I just want to lay out a few examples of where we would use either one of these bioplastic formulations. So for a drop-in bioplastic, it makes the most sense to use in a drop-in bioplastic in a situation where virgin plastics are currently required. And if you know anything about EcoEnclose, and if you don't, our number one goal is to include as much recycled content as possible in our products. And so we are going to be pushing to have as high as levels as possible of recycled content. But for some products right now, the technology is not there to allow us to get up to 100% recycled content. And so an example of when we'd use a drop-in bioplastic is here in our bubble mailers. Currently, they are made of 50% recycled content, which is really exciting. It's probably the highest in the market. However, there is still 50% of that mailer that's made up with virgin poly and virgin plastic. And so a drop-in biopolymer would be a really great use case to supplement that 50% that's currently virgin. And that would allow us to then have input materials that are either bio-based, assuming they come from a good source, and or recycled. As we know about new formulation bioplastics, they are a unique structure, and so each individual polymer has its own specific end of life and use case. And so a new formulation bioplastic is typically most helpful because it is not designed to behave like a petroleum-based plastic. It's most helpful in a situation where the optimal end of life for that packaging is biodegradation. And we see this most frequently with food packaging. So a bioplastic with new formulation most commonly will be a utensil, a straw, or otherwise a bioplastic that contains food and brings it to the compost and then does not contaminate the recycling stream. Our takeaway from this first section is really to understand that bioplastic does not mean one specific thing. It is an umbrella term, and so we want to be sure that we are not just using the term bioplastic and assuming that we and others have the same idea of what we're talking about. It's really important to dig into the details of each polymer to learn where it comes from and its best use case as well as end of life. In this next section, we are going to talk about when using bioplastics is a better option than using a typical recycled plastic. Bioplastics are a really, really interesting technology, and they bring a lot of benefits to the table, but really their use cases are best determined by what that product is going to accomplish and its end of life. At EcoEnclose, we look primarily to some of the leading organizations and research groups in packaging to make our decisions and to help guide our sustainability framework. And so we relied quite heavily on the Sustainable Packaging Coalition's research and stances and information about bioplastics and compostable packaging. You can learn more about the Sustainable Packaging Coalition, or SPC, if you're interested in this kind of research. They're an awesome resource. And so based on this information as well as our own research, there are three really great situations for when to use these bioplastics or dissolvable plastics that we've researched in this paper. The first is when the goal of that bioplastic is to capture and divert food waste from the landfill or from the recycling stream as contamination. And so a new formulation, biodegradable plastic, like we'd mentioned before, when that product is designed to package food or be a takeout container or be a fiber-based compostable packaging that's interacting with food and becoming soiled, that's a really great situation to use a bioplastic or compostable packaging. The second situation would be a drop-in bioplastic, like we talked about before, when using recycled content isn't possible. We always really want to prioritize using materials that are already existing, and so that's why recycled content is always, always, always our number one pick, specifically post-consumer waste. Doing so really allows us to spur the recycling system and make packaging out of packaging instead of making packaging out of, source materials that are coming from raw goods or from the earth. The third situation is a very small percentage of packaging in the market right now, is these dissolvable plastics. And so an example is PVOH, or polyvinyl alcohol. That is the clear covering of a liquid laundry detergent or dishwasher detergent. That is what keeps all of that liquid inside and then dissolves through the cleaning process. A dissolvable plastic is really the most well used when the existing end of life is water solubility. And so we would not want to put a dissolvable plastic on an e-commerce packaging situation just because that end of life is not supposed to be with water solubility. This dissolvable plastic category is very small, and we want to be very cognizant of what we are choosing to use it for because it does play a very, very critical impact on our water supply. There is a lot of excitement in the packaging space about bioplastics and their potential to really change the game in terms of sustainable packaging. We always want to make sure that we are using science-based and data-based decisions and targets in our packaging framework. And so because bioplastics are such an exciting and interesting option, we want to make sure that our emotions about bioplastics are not overshadowing what the data tells us and the facts about those polymers. And so we have used data very, very strongly to really guide our decision-making process. And so this question we get all of the time, and it is, when is biodegradable better than recyclable in e-commerce packaging? And this is pretty specific to e-commerce. It's not the same as all food packaging or all product packaging or single-use packaging in other scenarios, but for e-commerce. And so we find that biodegradable is better than recyclable almost never when it comes to e-commerce. And there are three main reasons that we have looked into and delved into that data to see on the source input side, the use case of that packaging, and the end of life. We're going to dive into why recycled content is our number one source input a little bit later, but for now I want to shed a little bit of light on what the reality of raw materials in bioplastics really looks like. And even though these bioplastics that are bio-based are grown from crop-based, plant-based sources, I think it's important to recognize that even though they are coming from crops, those crops are still being grown in a very energy, time, water, resource-intensive way in order to make packaging that is often single-use. And in our eyes, that really does replicate the virgin source material, even though it's not the same virgin source that we think of for petroleum-based sources, which is oil or natural gas or derivatives of oil and gas. Bioplastics are still primarily grown out of the ground as monocrop in industrial farming situations. And a lot of times this farmland can push on the natural boundaries of what an ecosystem can offer. And so farmland expansion, as we understand, can be really threatening to some critical habitats and ancient forests, rainforests, and habitats and ecosystems of really important animals and plant biodiversity. So what we want to make sure is that when they are being sourced, we want to look into what the context is for each source material. Is it grown in a monocrop industrial farming situation? Is it reliant on a lot of pesticides and fertilizers? Does it threaten the health of the ecosystem nearby? Does it increase biodiversity and act in a regenerative nature through growth? And so those are some of the questions we always ask when it comes to bio-based products. But again, I just want to focus on, even though they are bio-based versus petroleum-based, we still consider that a virgin source just because it is grown for the sole purpose of creating a biopolymer. I mentioned previously we use really data-based and science-based data points in order to make decisions about what materials we're using. And although bioplastics and bio-based compostable packaging can be really, really exciting, and we know there's a lot of excitement for consumers out there, we also want to be balancing that with what does the data tell us. And so in this first section here, we're going to be diving into the data behind the source inputs. And here is a screenshot from one of our LCAs that we performed. This shows 10 pounds of virgin LDPE, which is low density polyethylene. By that we mean standard petroleum-based plastic, versus 10 pounds of PLA, which is a bio-based plastic that is composted at the end of its life. And then lastly, a recycled low-density polyethylene. And so that 100% recycled LDPE is the same structure as the virgin LDPE, but just made with recycled content. And so what we see here, if you look at this graph, the red bar is telling us what amount of carbon dioxide impact is coming from that source material, just the source material itself. And so as you can see, recycled plastic actually has the lowest impact in the material, the source material space. And that makes sense, right? Because we're not making a brand new product. We're using a material that's already in existence. And so we don't have to pull from the earth or pull from oil and gas in order to make this new product. We're using what's already available. And so that impact is very small. Then if you look at the virgin LDPE, it's about, I would say, almost triple the impact of the recycled LDPE. And so that source material is also very carbon intensive just to produce. But lastly, if we look at this composted PLA, it's a little counterintuitive, but you can see that it's almost quadruple the amount of impact in the source material in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that can be very counterintuitive. We think that because something is grown from the earth, it has a negative or low impact. That's not always the case. And specifically when we look at PLA, which is grown typically from corn, industrial corn, and ethanol, we can understand, there is a significant impact, and there are a lot of source materials, time, energy, water, fertilizers, space and land that is required in order to grow that much corn in order to produce it into a plastic. And so, when we take corn and have to turn it into a polymer, that also requires a good amount of manufacturing. And so this red bar shows us the source itself, that raw material. This gray part is the manufacturing of that material into its final form. And so they're all about the same for these three. And then the end of life. So we can see that recycled LDPE that is recycled, as well as the virgin LDPE that is recycled as well. Those guys have just about the same impact in terms of the end of life carbon. And the composted PLA, this is going through an industrial compost system. PLA can be backyard compostable, but is most frequently industrially compostable. And so that's the space that it goes through for its end of life. But as we're looking at this can be very counterintuitive, but this gave us a huge, huge clue to, hey, if we really are focused on reducing our carbon emissions of the materials we're using, it makes the most sense for us to be using recycled content. Now we want to look at the data when it comes to the use case or the functionality of a bioplastic in its actual use versus a recycled plastic. And something to note when it comes to bioplastics, whether they are bio-based or biodegradable or both, they tend to be less robust as a recycled plastic or a virgin petroleum-based plastic. And so they typically have a shorter shelf life. This is not super relevant for folks who are manufacturing and producing food products that have an existing shelf life that they're trying to work around as is. But it is important to think about when it comes to e-commerce brands and folks who are selling D2C. Those products that they have want to be shipped out at a reasonable pace. And so if we are running into a situation where lots of bioplastic packaging materials are purchased all at once and stored, it's important to understand that they do have a shorter shelf life than their recycled alternative, and they'll need to be worked through at a faster pace to make sure that they are in good shape by the time they get to the customer. The other important note in terms of the functionality of bioplastics versus recycled plastics is they have a lower amount of moisture resistance, and this is specifically for new formulation bioplastics. It's less relevant for drop-in bioplastics because drop-in bioplastics are designed to mimic the same chemical and physical properties of petroleum-based plastics. But when it comes to plastics that are meant to biodegrade, like our new formulation bioplastics, they do have less of a moisture resistance because their goal is eventually to break down and biodegrade. And so if that's something that, interacting with weather and moisture is something that's possible for the packaging that you're using, it's important to consider that this is going to be different for bioplastics. The last concept that we're digging into for our impact analysis is the end of life of a plastic, bioplastic versus a recycled and recyclable plastic. There is this concept in product creation and specifically packaging, and it's this concept of technically versus widely. And the relevance of that is we can talk about it with recycling as well. So there are some materials that are technically recyclable, and I would argue that almost all materials can be technically recycled if there is the machinery and the technology to make it happen. And so this concept of technically recyclable is much different than widely recyclable. So if you are thinking about two different products, right? One is a thin film poly mailer that you got in the mail from an online order from a company. That poly mailer is not recyclable curbside, but it is technically recyclable when you drop it off at a thin film drop-off. Now, when you think about that, there are two vastly different effort and energy requirements for you to put something in your curbside recycling bin versus go drop it off at the grocery store on your next trip. Compare that to a piece of paper or cardboard. Cardboard is technically recyclable and widely recyclable. And so you can put cardboard or paper right in your curbside bin, and it's taken and very quickly turned back into a new product because it's a very valuable product, and it's widely recycled. That same concept of technically versus widely is also relevant for bioplastics. And so many of the bioplastics we've looked into in this study are technically biodegradable. And when I say technically biodegradable, it means that they've passed a certain standard or sustainability criteria in order to be deemed technically biodegradable. However, that backs up against this concept of widely biodegradable. So what we looked into for our analysis is, if we want the majority of the people who receive our packaging to be able to dispose of it in the way it's designed for, how does biodegradable stack up against recyclable? And so when we look at and this is for USA data, and so these are for US residents, but the access to curbside recycling among Americans, 73% of US residents have access to curbside recycling. That's vastly different than when we look at the access to municipal or industrial composting, whether it's through your city or municipality or something you pay for individually. Only 4% of US residents as of 2021 have access to industrial composting on the regular. And we dug into those numbers a little bit as well because we really wanted to learn of those composters across the country, who is using bioplastic e-commerce packaging? Do they want it? Is it helpful? Does it create beneficial compost at the end of its life? And what we found, we surveyed composters from the 20 most populous cities. Only 2 of those 2 composters in the entire country would accept bioplastic e-commerce packaging, and they would only accept it if it was clearly labeled as BPI certified. And so that is a much, much smaller number. And so based on these 2 numbers here, it makes way more sense for us to be creating packaging that's designed for recyclability, specifically curbside recyclability, versus composting, because if we're designing for something that very few people have legitimate access to, we just don't really want to be setting folks up for failure or make it so that people feel confused or bad about what they're doing at the end of life of that packaging. The takeaway from this section is really to have a better understanding and a more, I think, wide perspective of the impact of polymers throughout their entire lifespan, through manufacturing, through production, and then through the end of life. Just because bioplastics are, if they are made from bio-based sources, does not automatically mean they are lower impact than a recycled or even a virgin alternative. Then the second concept that I would love if you could take with you is this technically biodegradable versus widely biodegradable. We think it's really important to plan for the waste stream that is most accessible to your consumers and really plan around that reality. Recycled content is our number 1 source input here at EcoEnclose. It's really important to us to be using materials that are already in existence that we can repurpose and reutilize into products that folks need and businesses need. So e-commerce packaging is a space that a lot of companies need. Most of us see it on our doorstep at one time or another, and that need and demand is only growing. And so when it comes to making e-commerce packaging, we want to be using materials that are already in existence, that can be made from existing packaging into new packaging that can then be designed for becoming packaging again in its next life. So that circularity is very, very important to us, and recycled content is our number 1 preferred input, specifically post-consumer waste. Post-consumer waste is the type of recycled content that comes directly from your blue bin. Here is a little refresher on the recycling process. A lot of times as consumers, we only see one part of the recycling process. We see our blue bin, and we see the packaging that we have, and as it goes into our individual blue bin, or if we're recycling at a commercial location, we're really just on one side of that cycle. That recycling cycle is contributing material. But the recycling process is so much bigger, and brands play a really, really interesting role here. The consumer is who we want to design for, right? However, it's important to recognize that materials go through this entire process in order to make it all the way around the circle and to be a material that is valuable and a high price or high value commodity in this space. And so if we think about, all of these actors have to be in unison and connected and feeling like their part is valuable in order for this entire cycle to work. And so we as consumers, we recycle our cardboard boxes. They go to a municipality or our waste hauler, whether it's your city or municipality that takes your recycling, or if you pay directly for a waste hauler to take it, they are taking it down to an MRF, which is the recycling center. A MRF stands for the Materials Recovery Facility. So this is where all the recycling goes and is dumped out of the dump trucks and organized by weight and type and material into specific bales of product, whether it's paper and cardboard or steel or low density polyethylene or polypropylene or HDPE, or aluminum. It gets brought into all these different streams and organized. And that MRF, the point of their existence really is to take in new material, to sort it, and to make sure that it is in tip-top shape so that it can be bought by someone who wants to use that material next. And we really need these next two players in this cycle in order to be having a really robust recycling system. We need reclaimers who are taking those finished bales of recycled product and turning it into the next version of its life. And so a reclaimer or a paper mill, smelter is specific to metals, but an extruder is specific to plastic. All of these folks want to buy those bales from the MRF, but it only makes sense for them to purchase those materials if there is an end customer for them. And a lot of times that customer is a brand. So for us, we are a customer of these players in this field, these reclaimers, the paper mills, the smelters, the extruders. We are their end customer. And so what's important to us is that we are creating demand for that recycled content and material by purchasing it from the folks who are continuing that cycle of the materials moving. And this plays a really big impact when we think about, overall, by using recycled content, the impact that a brand can have, even just one brand. So EcoEnclose, we're a little unique in this space because we work directly with businesses. But if I was, say, a big brand name, purchasing recycled content to use in my product or in my packaging, then I'm having a really big impact on this recycling system and its strength and how robust it is. So if you look at the left here, we are really proud of the amount of recycled content that we create demand for. And so in the bottom, you'll see this. This is the Association of Plastic Recyclers. EcoEnclose was named a APR Recycling Demand Champion because we're helping to create demand for recycled materials and thus increase their value in the market. And then up top here, we also like to quantify the impact that using recycled content has had. And so we produce packaging for hundreds of thousands of brands to use in their e-commerce operations. And because of that, just by using recycled content, EcoEnclose and thus all of the brands that we work with have this giant collective impact of saving, 147,000 trees from being cut down. That's a really great impact that we're excited about. Using recycled content just in and of itself is a really exciting thing for us to be able to do and a core piece of our mission. it also has this really cool impact on the rest of the world in these formats called co-benefits. So here in this picture of bales, this is what I was talking about before. This is the final product for aluminum, steel, high-density polyethylene, polypropylene, PET, all these different materials that we are dutifully recycling and going through the recycling system. They really are only valuable if someone wants to buy them. They're really processed very well, taken good care of if we know that there is a buyer at the end, in which case brands play an incredible impact there. And some of the co-benefits that are sort of overlooked by using recycled content really have a lot to do with our direct impact on the natural environment. So when we use recycled content products and materials that are already existing instead of virgin products, we're doing a lot of really great things, right? Because we're using recycled paper, we don't have a need to cut down trees, whether they are responsibly managed through FSC or not. We do not have to use freshwater resources or run into the potential problem of impacting habitats or natural ecosystems. We're creating, like I said, a strong market for reclaimed and recycled goods. We're increasing their value, which works its way all through the chain in a very positive format. So as we're increasing the value of those products, it means that recyclers are more likely to expand the things that they recycle and recover because there's a buyer at the end of that. By using recycled content instead of growing trees to use for input, or in the case of bioplastics, inputs like corn, sugar beets, sugar cane, really monocrop industrial level crops. We are not using land in order to produce packaging. And to us, it just kind of makes sense. We don't think trees are best used as packaging. We don't think crops and food are best used as single-use packaging. And so using recycled content allows us to really protect these important wild spaces. And then lastly, something that's really exciting about using materials in a new way is you're bolstering a domestic supply chain and really building on the strength of recycled content and increasing the value of the jobs that help to get recycled content to a product. The takeaway here is that recycled content is just a really great choice for a source input material, and we want to utilize it as much as possible. When we're using it, it's got quantitatively a low impact, but also it plays really important roles in lots of different ecosystems and other environmental goals that a company or a person might have. We're going to jump now into some of the key questions that we've developed when we are assessing and vetting bioplastics out. And again, they'll fall into these three main categories: the source inputs, the use cases, and the end of life. After reviewing the 9 biopolymers that are most common on the market right now, some of the questions that I was asking in order to determine whether or not these are overall net positive polymers to be used in packaging, I wrote a lot of these questions down, and they're very similar to our traditional sustainable packaging framework as well. But here I share a little bit about what we use in order to vet out new materials on the market, especially bioplastics. So you can feel free to use these questions. You can adopt them. You can totally steal them from us. We are a big believer in open source knowledge when it comes to materials and packaging, because this is a space that's growing so rapidly. But when it comes to source inputs, here are the main things we want to focus on, right? The first is, what is the feedstock that is used for the polymer? And then some follow-up questions: is it petroleum-based? If it is not petroleum-based, we assume that it is bio-based. And because it's bio-based, the next question would be, is it grown in a degenerative way? The example there is massive monocrops like corn and sugarcane that can put pressure on existing ecosystems, or can expand and expand and expand in order to meet the demand of that polymer. So we want to know, like, is that grown in a net positive way, or is it grown in a degenerative way to the soil and the environment around it? The next question would be, could it be created with regenerative inputs or new waste streams? An example there would be, could we use food waste in order to create a biopolymer? That would be an awesome solution for an existing waste stream that doesn't have a purpose at this moment. Or, is there an existing agricultural residue or waste stream that right now does not have a good end of life, is being landfilled or not used in a positive way? Could we use something like that in order to create this source polymer? The next question we want to focus on is the feedstock itself. Is it degenerative by nature? And so there is a way that crops can be grown in a regenerative way, which means that it is giving back to the soil, the environment, the local biodiversity communities, the insects, all of the levels of the food chain. It's actually building up the value and the carbon sink of that area. And that is called regenerative. So we can look at different crops in a different lens. And some crops by nature tend to be pretty exhaustive in the way that they are grown and treat an environment. And corn is a really good example of this. We have quite a bit of industrial farming of corn in the United States, and it can be grown frequently in ways that are meant to be a means to an end, to make sure that the amount of supply and demand is equal, and our earth and our soil does not really behave like a machine. It doesn't behave the way that we force, production of a specific quota of product. So it's important to recognize, even if a product is grown, is it grown in a regenerative way? Is it grown in a degenerative way? How much land use does it require? Is it pushing on any critical ecosystems to expand in order to keep up with demand? Does it threaten any ancient or endangered forests or rainforests? This is a big one we want to focus on because ancient and endangered forests are some of the biggest carbon sinks in the world. They keep a ton of carbon there. They're also home to some of the world's most incredible species and huge pockets of biodiversity. And those are things that we just really, really cherish, and we want to make sure we're not touching those. And then lastly, does it require high levels of fertilizers and pesticides or other petroleum-based inputs in order to maintain? Backing up a little bit more, what is the carbon footprint, generally speaking, of that source input? And does it rely on petroleum-based products? And so an example here would be polyvinyl acetate and ethylene glycol, both of which are the inputs for certain biopolymers that are discussed in this research paper. Polyvinyl acetate is combined with water to create PVOH, or polyvinyl alcohol. That is a dissolvable plastic and actually does rely quite a bit on petroleum-based products in order to be produced. The next set of questions focuses on the functionality and the use case of a biopolymer. So here are our main questions that we used when determining and analyzing these biopolymers for use in e-commerce. The first is, what is it designed for functionally? Is it designed to be a thin film plastic replacement? Is it designed to be a drop-in biopolymer for a rigid plastic? Is it supposed to be used in more agricultural applications or interaction with water? A lot of times when we look at biopolymers and realize that, hey, they're bio-based, that seems really cool, we should use this instead of regular plastic. The first thing that we really need to consider is, what is the functional use case of that plastic? An agricultural applicated bioplastic for, fertilizer coatings or, nets that may dissolve over time. Those are things that have a very different functional requirement in terms of the technical aspects of that polymer than a polymailer, right? A polymailer is only used probably 1 or 2 times. It has a pretty short lifespan, and it can contain a lot of recycled content and contribute back to that recycling process. That's a very different application than something that is meant to live in the ground. So what is it designed for functionally? Secondly is, does it behave in the same way as traditional petroleum-based plastic? and are there functional drawbacks? And we talked about this earlier. What does the shelf life compare? How does the moisture barrier compare to traditional plastics? The next is, what is the formulation of the polymer? Is it a new formulation or that unique type of formulation that's produced when we create a brand new biopolymer? Or is it designed to mimic existing plastic structures like a drop-in bioplastic? And then lastly, what would make this biopolymer that we're considering a better option than recycled plastics? We always want to return to this because we know recycled plastics, in a quantitative way, are the lowest impact input material we can use. So in order to consider a different plastic, specifically biopolymer, we want to circle back and say, what about this is better when it comes to the data than a recycled plastic? Now, lastly, our end-of-life questions. So these are some of the hoops that we want all of our biopolymers to jump through to make sure that they are really meeting our needs and our standards for sustainable packaging. So when it comes to the end of life, this is really specific for biopolymers. There are a lot of different types of waste streams that biopolymers can be marketed to, and that may not always be a good thing. So we want to make sure, first of all, what is the intended end of life for a biopolymer? And we want to not only just use our own common sense there, but want to go back to the manufacturer or the distributor, the producer of that biopolymer. What are they saying the best waste stream or intended end of life is for that biopolymer? And that's what we want to go by. That distributor or manufacturer knows best, and they've designed it in a very specific way. And so definitely refer back to them to understand what's the actually intended end of life. Because sometimes it is biodegradation, other times it is not. Other times it's recycling. So we want to make sure we understand what's intended for that biopolymer. Secondly is how accessible to the average consumer is this intended end-of-life waste stream? So what we talked about before, curbside recycling is very accessible to Americans. Industrial composting is very inaccessible to Americans. So we want to figure out what the intended end-of-life is, but the more important question is, how accessible is that waste stream? If it's really hard to get to, there's a good chance that the intended end-of-life is not going to happen for the majority of your product. And you don't want customers in a situation where they feel like they have to landfill something that they should have composted, or feel very confused about, what am I supposed to do here? I want to do the right thing, but I'm not sure what it is. And so the accessibility is a huge, huge part of end of life. The next is a little more nuanced and really what we want to focus on here at EcoEnclose, which is if things can technically be biodegraded or recycled. The next question is it actually valuable for those people who are managing those waste streams to have that? And does that waste stream have the capacity to accept this material? The example that I'll use is polyvinyl alcohol, PVOH. I've talked about it a little bit before. It is the dissolvable plastic that surrounds water-soluble products like laundry detergent and dishwasher detergent. So if we were going to change, let's say, all of our disposable cutlery from what it is now to polyvinyl alcohol and dissolve it down the sink, the next question we have to ask is, does our water treatment system have the capacity to treat this material at high volumes? If it were to go mainstream, does water treatment systems have that ability to not only find that product in its filtration system, but also treat it? The next, good question to ask whenever you're designing something is to ask the people who are going to be disposing of it or making it into something new, whether or not it's helpful to them, whether or not they want that material in their systems. And that's really relevant for composters and bioplastics for composters. The next question is also, does the technology to effectively treat this material exist widespread? And the example I give here comes back to this polyvinyl alcohol example, where if we're putting a bunch of dissolvable plastics down our water system, down our pipes and sewer system. Do we have the technology to treat that material widespread? And when it comes to wastewater specifically, wastewater and water treatment is actually a system in the United States that could use a lot of revamping and is a very reactive system. And so wastewater treatment systems tend to treat what they are used to treating, and they're not going to be adding technology just because new materials are on the market. And so in that capacity, we want to be really, really prudent about what we're putting into certain waste streams based on the fact that that technology to treat materials does not always exist all over the place and can take a long time to come to light and to be actually implemented into a wastewater treatment system, for example. Next would be, does this material have the potential to create marine pollution like ocean plastics or disintegrate into microplastics? Bioplastics are often used as sort of this silver bullet for ocean pollution and ocean plastics. We think that if it's bio-based and or biodegradable, it will not create any microplastics. The reality of that question is a lot more complex. So there are some materials that have passed us a certain threshold for not creating microplastics. However, it's really hard to tell, and there's not a ton of testing ability to determine whether or not a material really in the real world and in several different water ecosystem scenarios always breaks down the same. And so we always want to be sure, even though this is biodegradable technically, do we know for sure that it will not create marine pollution? And then lastly, this is more of an overarching concept in our compass towards what is the best material to use. Is this material circular or closed loop by nature? And when I say circular or closed loop, what I mean is this concept of turning packaging into packaging to be made into more packaging. We want that product to be used for as many cycles as possible because it keeps that energy use down. It takes advantage of materials that already exist, and then reduces the overall impact carbon-wise and material-wise of that product. The opposite of a circular or closed-loop system is a linear system. We see linear systems almost all the time with most single-use products we have now. They're extracted from the earth in some capacity, they're produced into a material or a product, and then we send them back into the landfill. And that's typically where it ends up. It's a very linear system. It's going from one direction to the other. It's not circling back, it's not coming back up. That same linear concept can be applicable to bioplastics, right? So if they're coming from petroleum-based sources like a PVOH is, coming from effectively glue and water, if PVOH is produced in that way, used one time and then sent into the wastewater treatment facility or water treatment facility, we're not going into the water treatment facility and pulling out all of the microscopic compounds of PVOH and then turning it back into its original form. That's effectively the same linear concept as traditional plastics or sending things into the landfill. The takeaways here from this questions section, I would love for you to leave this moment thinking about the fact that often the source inputs of a biopolymer or any material really, they're typically the biggest driver of the carbon footprint and the environmental impact of that material, and in this case biopolymers. And then secondly, having a sustainability framework or a checklist or list of questions really to run through helps you to easily compare materials to what your sustainability standards may be. And for EcoEnclose, we rely very heavily on our frameworks. So now we get to talk about the fun part, which is our ideal e-commerce bioplastic. This is what, if we could dream up a bioplastic tomorrow and make it happen to include in our e-commerce packaging applications, this is what it would be. In order to meet our criteria for the dream bioplastic out there for us, it would need to meet all of these input requirements. So the first, what I talked about, sourced from regenerative crops or biofeedstocks that are, some examples here are algae. Algae is a material that is by nature carbon negative. A lot of carbon is pulled in by algae, and they're incredibly prolific and easy to grow in several different environments. They don't have a huge environmental impact when they're grown in a controlled manner. So algae is a great example. Another example is agricultural residues. I had talked about this a little bit earlier, but this picture here with the bales of what looks like hay is actually wheat straw. And so wheat straw is an example of an agricultural residue or a waste stream that comes from agriculture that does not currently have a great use. And so if we could reutilize an existing waste stream that is coming from a farm or an operation that is by nature regenerative or at least not degenerative, not an industrial crop, that would be a great feedstock. And then lastly, if we could dream, maybe we find a way to turn food waste that is not used for compost amendment or an existing waste stream of an organic material for an input material for bioplastics. These second two requirements I kind of talked about a little bit, but required for us would be we'd want something that is created and harvested without the risk of endangering really important ecosystems, placing pressure on those environments to support a higher and higher growth capacity for that feedstock. And this comes into this little tiger right here. We focus quite a bit on recycled content, not only because it makes a lot of sense in terms of data and the source inputs and the carbon footprint, but also because it keeps us far away from ecosystems. We don't have to put pressure on species or biodiversity in order to make product. And that's really important to our sustainability framework. The last is carbon neutral or negative. There are many, many, many environmental issues we're all facing at this moment. Perhaps the most urgent in order for us to solve is climate change and the impact of greenhouse gases and global warming on the planet. And so because we understand that that is the most timely in terms of environmental problems to solve and to work towards, we want to be putting carbon neutrality or carbon negative at the very top of anything that we do, or at least like the bare minimum of any material we use. We really want to make sure that it is not contributing to more and more carbon in the atmosphere. In terms of function, our ideal bioplastic for e-commerce would be a drop-in biopolymer. And the reason for that is because we design for recyclability here at EcoEnclose. Because it's the most accessible waste stream, because it keeps materials moving, we always design our packaging for recyclability. And because we're designing for recyclability, a new formulation bioplastic does not make a lot of sense for us because frequently it requires going to industrial compost to be correctly disposed of. So we would want it to be a drop-in bioplastic in function. It'll also meet the needs of e-commerce packaging. It's not pulling away from the function of existing packaging. It's not reducing the shelf life. It's not making that packaging really susceptible to weather or environmental differences or water. It's really meeting the needs and not taking away from the functionality of what e-commerce packaging needs to be. And then compared to recycled plastic, it does not sacrifice any of the following requirements that we had talked about when e-commerce packaging is actually used by you and received by your customer is the shelf life, the strength of that packaging, and its tensile strength, or the amount of ways it can be used or applied. There is this saying that I have heard many times, and it is design with the end in mind. And because I think that's very applicable to packaging and sustainability in general, I'd mentioned before, but we really design with this end of recycling in mind. We want folks to recycle our packaging so that we can, in some way, buy that material back up or continue to be a pull factor for these MRFs and reclaimers, so that we can create more packaging and continue this cycle, right? So if we're designing with the end in mind of recyclability, we really want the packaging that we're using, whether in this case is bioplastic, to be readily recycled in existing and accessible streams. Curbside recyclability is preferred. A drop-in biopolymer is then what we would use. We understand that at this point, many plastics in e-commerce are thin film, and they have to be dropped off at a box store or a big box store or a retailer or a grocery store with grocery bags. And so we understand that that is the reality at this point for most thin film plastics. Ideally, we would love for curbside recyclability to be the number one end of life we're designing for, because it's the most accessible to Americans. The next is this closed loop and circular concept. It has the ability to be recycled back into itself. There are some materials that can be, again, technically recycled, but that when they are recycled, they're typically downcycled. What I mean by that is that, let's say I have a thin film poly mailer or a poly bag. When those are thin film recycled through number 2 and number 4 specific stream, frequently those materials are downcycled into another product and not into themselves again. And so thin film plastic is typically turned into composite lumber, and those plastic benches that you see around, a lot of the time that is recycled LDPE number 2, number 4 plastics. So that's obviously not ideal. We want to be using materials in the same capacity over and over. And ideally, this bioplastic would be able to be recycled back into itself so that we can use it again instead of downcycled into a product that is pretty stationary and not in the recycling stream anymore. And then lastly, if we were ever to consider a bioplastic for dissolvability, or that is dissolvable by nature, we really need to ensure that it is non-toxic in aquatic environments to animals, fish, microorganisms, all of the members of the food chain of the aquatic system. We want to make sure it's very non-toxic. And then as well as non-toxic to animals, we want to ensure that if we are using a dissolvable plastic, it is not contributing to pollution in some capacity. So prudence when it comes to water is really important to us. We've seen so many different chemicals come up into the market over the last 50, 60 years that we use widespread, and then we find out after the fact it has a very negative impact on the environment. Some examples are DDT and its impact on native bird species. Another example is microplastics, right? When we were scrubbing our faces with microbeads, they were all going down, the sink, and now we're in human bloodstreams in 2022. And so we want to be super sure that anything we're putting down the sink or into the water treatment system can be effectively treated and is not going to cause casualty down the road. So all at once, here are all of the requirements that our ideal e-commerce bioplastic would include. Feel free, again, to use this as your own inspiration. You can absolutely take this framework. You can take these questions. We encourage you to really consider them when you are thinking about bioplastics in e-commerce. It's really critical, I believe, to ask all these questions and understand in detail what you're getting into before implementing a material widespread into the supply chain. So the main takeaway here, there is no bioplastic that's currently on the market that meets our vision for circularity and our standards for sustainable input materials. And just wrapping this up, we really find that, as of today, based on the data and the research that we've done, recycled content is still very much superior to any bioplastic material available when it comes to e-commerce applications. And so we recognize, there's nothing right now on the market that really would be much better than recycled content. And so we continue to really focus on pulling in post-consumer waste plastic and using recycled content, whether it's paper-based or plastic-based, instead of moving to a bioplastic, just because we don't find that it brings a lot of benefit. However, as we explore more use cases where the preferred end of life is composting, or where we have to use virgin plastic, but we can't, or we have to use virgin plastic and not recycled, and can use a drop-in biopolymer. Those are situations where a bioplastic may really meet our framework and be a very good solution for us. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I hope that this was helpful in helping you to understand bioplastics, understand their best use case, and then some of the best questions to ask when you're considering them. You can find all of our data and research on our website. You can read the entire white paper if you would like to, but if you go to ecoenclose.com/bioplastics, we've got all of the matrices that have been created, some of which were in this video, all of the matrices that show you the overarching landscape of materials that are available, the source inputs in great detail for each polymer, and then the end-of-life implications for each biopolymer. We reviewed 9 overall, and we've got a place on this landing page for you to look at all of the details for each one of them. We always welcome feedback here at EcoEnclose. We are constantly trying to learn, and so we always appreciate when folks in our community reach out to us, ask us questions, or let us know new areas that they're trying to understand and explore. And thank you.